She stood alone at the edge of the courtyard while everyone celebrated what they believed was the beginning of a perfect new life. The lights from the grand estate shimmered against polished marble walkways, elegant music drifted through the evening air, and guests raised their glasses to a groom who thought he had finally escaped the woman he no longer wanted. His elderly mother wore the smile of someone convinced she had won a battle years in the making. Beside him stood a younger bride dressed in white, completely unaware that every flower surrounding her, every crystal chandelier above her head, every luxury vehicle parked outside, and even the mansion where the ceremony was taking place legally belonged to the quiet woman watching from a distance. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading for another chance. She wasn't making a scene. Instead, she waited with remarkable patience as an attorney carrying a thick leather folder walked steadily toward the ceremony. Within moments the music faded, conversation stopped in mid-sentence, and expressions of celebration turned into faces frozen with disbelief. The groom's confidence disappeared almost instantly. The second bride began asking questions no one could answer. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The woman everyone had dismissed as powerless owned the mansion, owned the family business, owned the companies funding the lavish wedding, and owned the very homes where every member of her husband's family had lived for years without ever realizing it. Nobody, not even the man she had once trusted with her heart, had any idea. She was treated like she had nothing. Until one signature proved she owned everything. What happened next didn't simply end the marriage. It shattered an entire family's carefully constructed illusion and exposed how dangerous pride, greed, and assumptions can become when they replace gratitude and truth. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and follow this story till the end. Several years earlier, long before the wedding that brought everything crashing down, Olivia Carter appeared to live an ordinary life. Friends described her as thoughtful, generous, and remarkably private. She never wore expensive designer labels, rarely spoke about money, and preferred quiet dinners with close friends over lavish social gatherings. To anyone meeting her for the first time, she looked like a woman content with a comfortable middle-class life beside her husband, Ethan Brooks, an ambitious entrepreneur determined to build a respected business. Ethan often received compliments for his success, and many assumed his expanding company reflected years of hard work and exceptional business instincts. Olivia never corrected those assumptions. She applauded every milestone, encouraged every risk he believed was worth taking, and celebrated every achievement as though it belonged entirely to him. What nobody realized was that many of the opportunities credited to Ethan had quietly become possible because of financial decisions Olivia had made years before. She never sought recognition. She believed genuine love did not require keeping score, and she never imagined that her silence would eventually become the greatest misunderstanding of her entire life. Olivia and Ethan's marriage had not begun with wealth or influence. They met during a volunteer fundraising event for a community literacy program, where Ethan was known for his ambition and Olivia was admired for her willingness to help without expecting recognition. Friends remembered how naturally they seemed to fit together. Ethan was outgoing, confident, and full of dreams about building a business that would someday give them financial freedom. Olivia was thoughtful, patient, and quietly determined to support the people she loved. They spent long evenings talking about the future, imagining the family they hoped to build and the life they believed would reward honesty and perseverance. When Ethan proposed, Olivia accepted without hesitation. She wasn't impressed by expensive gifts or elaborate promises. She believed character mattered more than possessions. Looking back years later, those who knew them would say the warning signs were almost impossible to notice because they were hidden beneath moments that looked like ordinary growing pains experienced by countless young couples trying to build a life together. Shortly before their wedding, Olivia's father invited her to his office for what seemed like an ordinary conversation. He had spent decades quietly assembling one of the most valuable privately owned commercial property portfolios in several states. Unlike many wealthy businessmen, he believed that displaying wealth often attracted the wrong kind of attention. He lived comfortably but modestly, drove practical vehicles, and taught his daughter that genuine security came from wisdom rather than appearance. During that meeting, he explained that most of his assets had already been transferred into carefully structured family trusts and holding companies with Olivia named as the principal beneficiary. He wasn't making the announcement to impress her. Instead, he wanted her to understand the responsibility that accompanied ownership. He reminded her that fortunes could disappear within a generation if placed in careless hands, and that the greatest test of character often came after acquiring wealth, not before it. Olivia listened carefully, accepted the responsibility, and promised never to allow money to define who she became. Her father also made one request that puzzled her at the time. He advised her not to discuss the full extent of the family's holdings unless circumstances truly demanded it. He explained that people often reveal their genuine intentions when they believe there is nothing to gain. Respect earned without the influence of wealth, he told her, was the only kind worth trusting. Olivia agreed, thinking the advice would never become important. She had complete faith in Ethan and believed their marriage would be built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. There seemed to be no reason to discuss assets that neither of them needed to think about. Ethan was passionate about growing his own company, and Olivia admired his desire to succeed through his own efforts. She quietly invested in his early business through legal financial arrangements managed by her family's advisors, ensuring that the investments appeared as institutional funding rather than personal gifts. Ethan celebrated every successful quarter believing he had earned each victory entirely on his own, never realizing that invisible support had prevented several difficult periods from ending in bankruptcy. As Ethan's business expanded, so did his confidence. The modest office where he had once worked alone transformed into an impressive headquarters filled with employees who respected him as an accomplished executive. Industry publications began featuring interviews about his leadership, and local business organizations invited him to speak at networking events. Olivia attended many of these occasions, sitting quietly near the back of crowded conference rooms while Ethan accepted awards and thanked mentors, colleagues, and investors for believing in his vision. She smiled proudly every time he succeeded because she genuinely wanted him to feel accomplished. Never once did she interrupt to mention that one investment had arrived just days before payroll became impossible to meet or that another financial guarantee had convinced hesitant lenders to extend crucial credit. She considered those actions part of supporting her husband rather than achievements deserving applause. Unfortunately, success has a way of changing how some people interpret the past. Gradually, Ethan began believing every good outcome resulted exclusively from his own intelligence and determination. Around the same time, Ethan's mother, Margaret Brooks, became increasingly involved in their lives. Margaret had always carried herself with unmistakable confidence, convinced that experience entitled her to influence every important family decision. In the early years of the marriage, Olivia made every effort to earn her approval. She remembered birthdays, prepared family dinners, attended holiday gatherings, and treated Margaret with sincere respect even when conversations became uncomfortable. Yet nothing ever seemed enough. Margaret viewed Olivia's quiet personality as evidence that she lacked ambition. She often compared her to women who enjoyed social attention, expensive fashion, and highly visible careers. She would compliment other wives in front of Olivia, suggesting they possessed qualities that better matched Ethan's growing status. Although the comments were usually disguised as harmless observations, their meaning became increasingly difficult to ignore. Olivia chose not to respond because she believed kindness would eventually soften Margaret's opinions. She underestimated how firmly those opinions had already taken root. Margaret admired appearances almost as much as she admired success. As Ethan's business continued attracting attention, she became deeply concerned with maintaining an image of prestige. She encouraged him to purchase luxury vehicles, host elaborate celebrations, and associate with influential people who could elevate the family's reputation. Olivia quietly questioned some of those decisions, not because the family couldn't afford them, but because she believed unnecessary extravagance often distracted people from what truly mattered. Ethan interpreted her caution as a lack of confidence in his achievements. Margaret reinforced that misunderstanding by suggesting Olivia simply didn't understand the expectations placed upon successful executives. Slowly, conversations that once ended in compromise began ending in silence. Ethan started seeking his mother's advice before discussing important matters with his wife. Olivia noticed the shift but hoped it represented only a temporary phase brought on by the pressures of rapid business growth. She still believed the man she married valued their partnership above outside opinions. Months passed, and subtle changes became impossible to ignore. Ethan stayed at the office later each evening, accepted more invitations to exclusive social events, and increasingly spoke about appearances, status, and influence. The warmth that had once defined their marriage gave way to polite conversations focused almost entirely on schedules and business commitments. Olivia continued supporting him in every practical way she could, yet she sensed that gratitude had quietly disappeared from the relationship. Whenever challenges arose, Ethan seemed quicker to question her judgment than to appreciate her perspective. Margaret's influence became even more visible during family gatherings, where she openly suggested that Ethan deserved someone who could better complement the image of a successful businessman. Relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether she intended those remarks as jokes or genuine criticism. Olivia remained composed, refusing to argue in front of family members. Deep inside, however, she began wondering whether silence was protecting her marriage or merely allowing misunderstandings to grow stronger with each passing month. What Olivia didn't know was that Margaret had already begun making plans that extended far beyond casual criticism. Convinced that her son had outgrown the woman who stood beside him from the beginning, she quietly started introducing him to people she considered more suitable for his new lifestyle. At elegant charity galas, exclusive business dinners, and carefully arranged social gatherings, Margaret ensured Ethan spent time with accomplished women who admired his growing reputation. One introduction in particular would eventually alter the course of every life connected to the Brooks family. Her name was Vanessa Collins, and from the moment Margaret watched the two of them exchange their first conversation, she became convinced she had finally found the woman she believed should have been Ethan's wife all along. Neither Margaret nor Vanessa had the slightest idea that the quiet woman they were preparing to replace was, in reality, the legal owner of nearly everything they admired. Vanessa Collins entered Ethan's life with remarkable confidence. She possessed the kind of charm that made people feel noticed within moments of meeting her, and she understood exactly how to make ambitious men feel admired. She complimented Ethan's accomplishments, laughed at stories he had repeated countless times, and praised his leadership in ways that gradually fed an ego already strengthened by years of professional success. Margaret noticed the effect immediately. Every conversation between them seemed effortless, every dinner invitation ended with smiles, and every social gathering reinforced her growing belief that Vanessa belonged beside her son. To Margaret, the comparison was obvious. Vanessa enjoyed elegant parties, spoke confidently about luxury travel, dressed in expensive fashion, and appeared comfortable in circles where wealth was openly displayed. Olivia, by contrast, still preferred simple evenings at home, volunteered quietly at local charities, and rarely attended events unless Ethan specifically asked her to accompany him. Margaret convinced herself that one woman represented the future while the other represented a chapter Ethan had already outgrown. The possibility that appearances could be misleading never crossed her mind. At first, Ethan insisted that Vanessa was simply another professional acquaintance introduced through mutual business contacts. Olivia accepted the explanation because trust had always been the foundation of their marriage. She believed every relationship deserved the benefit of honesty until proven otherwise. Yet over the following months, small details began collecting in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Ethan started receiving late-night messages that caused him to smile before quickly locking his phone. Business dinners became more frequent, often lasting well into the evening without clear explanations. Weekend meetings suddenly appeared on his calendar with unusual regularity, and Margaret enthusiastically defended every absence by reminding Olivia that successful executives often sacrifice family time to expand their companies. Olivia wanted to believe that explanation. She reminded herself that suspicion alone solved nothing. Still, an uncomfortable feeling settled quietly into her thoughts, not because she lacked trust in Ethan, but because his behavior no longer resembled the man she had married years earlier. Friends who had watched the marriage from the outside also noticed subtle changes. Couples who once received regular invitations from Ethan and Olivia now found themselves socializing almost exclusively with Ethan. When Olivia attended gatherings, conversations often felt strangely different. People would hesitate before mentioning events they assumed she already knew about, only to realize she had never been invited. Others awkwardly changed the subject whenever Vanessa's name entered the conversation. No one intended to hurt Olivia. Many simply believed the marriage was experiencing ordinary difficulties and hoped the situation would eventually resolve itself. Few understood how deeply Margaret had inserted herself into every important decision surrounding Ethan's personal life. She quietly encouraged family members to welcome Vanessa warmly, referring to her as someone who genuinely appreciated Ethan's accomplishments. Those words carried a painful implication that Olivia somehow no longer did. The truth was exactly the opposite. Olivia appreciated Ethan enough to protect his confidence, even when doing so required her own sacrifices to remain invisible. One rainy afternoon, Olivia visited the downtown office building where Ethan's company operated. She hadn't planned to surprise him. She simply wanted to deliver documents requiring his signature before leaving for another meeting with the family's legal advisors. As she entered the lobby, several employees greeted her politely, but something about their expressions immediately felt unusual. Some appeared nervous. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Before she could ask why, the receptionist quietly informed her that Ethan had stepped out for lunch with a client. Olivia thanked her, turned toward the elevator, and almost reached the executive floor before hearing laughter echo from the conference suite at the end of the hallway. The office door stood slightly open. Inside, Ethan and Vanessa sat together reviewing presentation materials while sharing the relaxed familiarity of people who had spent far more time together than either had admitted. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. No argument followed. No confrontation took place. Olivia simply watched for a brief moment before quietly walking away without allowing either of them to notice she had been there. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak arrives without raised voices. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any accusation ever could. That evening, Ethan returned home expecting another ordinary conversation. Instead, he found Olivia sitting on the back patio overlooking the gardens they had planted together years before. She calmly asked whether there was anything he wanted to tell her. Ethan hesitated just long enough for the silence between them to become its own answer. Rather than admitting the full truth, he insisted Vanessa was merely helping with an important business expansion and accused Olivia of allowing harmless observations to become unnecessary concerns. His explanation sounded carefully prepared, as though he had rehearsed those sentences long before the conversation ever occurred. Olivia listened without interruption. She wanted desperately to believe him, yet every instinct told her something essential had changed. When the discussion ended, she didn't argue or issue ultimatums. She simply wished him good night and walked upstairs. Ethan interpreted her quiet response as acceptance. In reality, it marked the first moment Olivia began preparing herself for the possibility that the marriage she had fought so hard to protect might already be slipping beyond repair. Over the following weeks, Margaret's confidence grew bolder. She no longer limited her opinions to private conversations with Ethan. During family dinner she openly praised Vanessa's intelligence, elegance, and compatibility with her son, sometimes speaking as though Olivia were little more than another guest seated at the table. Relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, embarrassed by the obvious disrespect unfolding before them. Olivia maintained remarkable composure, answering every comment with courtesy rather than resentment. Her restraint puzzled many people. Some assumed she lacked the courage to defend herself. Others believed she simply hadn't recognized what was happening around her. Only one person understood the reason behind her calm demeanor. Richard Lawson, the family's longtime attorney, had watched events unfold from a distance while managing the complex network of trust and corporate holdings established years earlier by Olivia's father. During one of their routine legal meetings, he noticed a sadness in Olivia's expression that hadn't been there before. After reviewing several documents, he gently closed the file, looked directly at her, and asked a question that would quietly change everything. "Olivia," he said, "if the people around you truly understood whose name is written on every one of these properties, do you think they would still treat you the same way?" Olivia lowered her eyes for a moment before answering with heartbreaking honesty. "I don't want respect that only appears after someone discovers what I own." Richard remained silent for several seconds, allowing her words to settle. He had represented wealthy families for more than 30 years and had witnessed fortunes create loyalty just as easily as they destroyed it. He understood something Olivia still hoped wasn't true. The issue facing her marriage was no longer about misunderstanding. It had become a question of character. Wealth could influence people's behavior, but it could never create genuine love where respect had already disappeared. Before she left his office that afternoon, Richard handed her an updated portfolio containing every legal document connected to her father's estate, including property deeds, corporate ownership records, shareholder agreements, investment accounts, and trust certifications worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Keep these somewhere safe," he quietly advised. "I have a feeling the day is coming when the truth won't be able to stay hidden any longer." Olivia accepted the folder without realizing that the moment Richard had been preparing for was much closer than either of them imagined. Across town, Margaret had already begun discussing wedding plans for Ethan and Vanessa, convinced the future belonged entirely to them. She celebrated a victory that had not yet been won, unaware that every plan she enthusiastically arranged rested upon foundations legally owned by the very woman she believed had already been defeated. Within a matter of weeks, the divorce became the central topic of conversation among relatives, neighbors, and longtime family friends. News spread quickly, although very few people knew the full story. Some assumed Ethan had simply fallen out of love after years of marriage. Others quietly blamed Olivia, believing she had become too reserved or too disconnected from the fast-paced world Ethan now occupied. Rumors grew with every passing day, each one drifting further from the truth than the last. Olivia heard many of them through mutual acquaintances, yet she refused to defend herself publicly. She understood something that many people never learn until much later in life. Opinions formed in the absence of facts often disappear the moment the truth arrives. Until then, arguing rarely changes anyone's mind. She chose dignity over confrontation, even though remaining silent came at a tremendous emotional cost. Every whispered conversation, every sympathetic glance, and every assumption about her marriage felt like another reminder that people often judge stories before hearing both sides. While Olivia quietly endured the speculation, Ethan appeared determined to embrace his new beginning. He and Vanessa attended charity galas together, accepted invitations to exclusive business dinners, and gradually allowed themselves to be seen publicly as a couple despite the divorce not yet being fully finalized. Margaret encouraged every appearance, convinced that public confidence would silence criticism before it had a chance to grow. She introduced Vanessa to friends as the woman who finally understands my son, a statement that left many listeners uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her directly. Vanessa accepted the attention with enthusiasm. She enjoyed the admiration, the photographs, the conversations about luxury vacations, and the subtle acknowledgement that she had stepped into a life many people envied. Looking around at Ethan's impressive home, expensive vehicles, and successful company, she believed she was marrying one of the city's most accomplished businessmen. She never considered the possibility that ownership and appearance are not always the same thing. Olivia, meanwhile, devoted more time to the charitable foundation established in her father's memory. The organization provided scholarships for first-generation college students, financial assistance for widows rebuilding their lives, and support for small community hospitals in underserved areas. Visiting those programs reminded her that genuine purpose existed far beyond the painful circumstances unfolding in her personal life. During one fundraising event, she met an elderly woman who thanked her through tears for helping pay for her granddaughter's education. The woman had no idea Olivia personally oversaw the foundation's work. She simply recognized her as another volunteer arranging chairs before guests arrived. Olivia smiled warmly and insisted that many generous people deserved the credit. That brief encounter stayed with her long afterward because it reflected the life she had always wanted, a life where kindness mattered more than recognition. Ironically, while others spent enormous energy protecting reputations built on appearances, Olivia found peace in serving people who never knew the extent of what she quietly contributed. Several days later, Richard Lawson requested another meeting. This time his tone carried greater urgency than usual. As Olivia entered his office, he slid a newspaper across the conference table. On one page appeared a large photograph of Ethan and Vanessa attending a luxury engagement celebration hosted by Margaret. The accompanying article described Ethan as the owner of an impressive real estate portfolio and one of the region's fastest-growing business leaders. Richard tapped the article gently with his finger before speaking. Every statement here assumes Ethan owns assets that legally belong to you. Olivia studied the article in silence. She wasn't offended by the praise Ethan received. What troubled her was how confidently misinformation had been presented as fact. Richard continued. Public perception isn't the issue. Legal consequences are. If contracts, financing agreements, or future transactions begin relying on false assumptions about ownership, this could become far more complicated than a divorce. Olivia looked up thoughtfully. For the first time, she realized the situation no longer affected only her emotions. It had the potential to create serious legal complications reaching far beyond family disagreements. Richard then opened another file that had remained locked inside his office safe for years. Inside rested documents signed shortly before Olivia's wedding. Her father had anticipated the possibility that future business relationships might become complicated, so he had included carefully written provisions protecting every major asset under Olivia's control. The language was clear, comprehensive, and remarkably difficult to challenge. The family residence where Margaret proudly entertained guests belonged to one trust. Ethan's corporate headquarters occupied land leased through another holding company. Several commercial properties generating steady rental income were connected to separate entities, all ultimately managed under structures naming Olivia as the controlling beneficiary. Even the luxury estate where Margaret hoped to host Ethan and Vanessa's wedding had never belonged to the Brooks family. Years earlier, Olivia had quietly authorized the property to be used by Ethan because she believed the marriage should never feel divided by ownership. She never imagined that same generosity would eventually convince everyone the estate belonged entirely to someone else. Richard carefully folded the documents before speaking again. There's another matter you should know. He explained that Margaret had recently contacted one of the estate management offices requesting extensive renovations before the upcoming wedding celebration. New landscaping, imported furnishings, custom lighting installations, and expensive structural improvements had all been requested without anyone verifying who actually possessed the legal authority to approve such work. Fortunately, the property managers had declined every request until receiving written authorization from the ownership trust. Since Olivia remained the authorized decision-maker, nothing had moved forward. She listened quietly, almost unable to believe how close they had come to altering property worth millions of dollars without the owner's knowledge. Did they ask who owned the estate? She finally asked. Richard offered a faint smile that carried more disappointment than amusement. No, he replied. They simply assumed. Across town, Margaret's confidence reached its highest point yet. Invitations for Ethan and Vanessa's wedding had been finalized, premium vendors had been reserved months in advance, and conversations centered almost entirely on creating the most unforgettable celebration possible. During a family dinner, Margaret proudly announced that the wedding would symbolize a fresh beginning for everyone. She raised a glass and declared that difficult chapters were finally behind them. Relatives applauded politely, though a few exchanged uncertain glances. Some privately wondered why everything seemed to be moving so quickly after the end of such a long marriage. Others questioned whether Olivia deserved more compassion than she had received. Those concerns remained unspoken. Celebration drowned out hesitation, and confidence silenced caution. Margaret interpreted every smile as confirmation that her decisions had been right all along. She had no reason to doubt herself because, in her mind, every obstacle had already been removed. Only one person sitting quietly at that dinner felt something was deeply wrong. Ethan's younger cousin, Michael, had always admired Olivia's kindness and couldn't reconcile the image being presented with the woman he had known for years. Several days later, he gathered enough courage to visit her unexpectedly. Olivia welcomed him warmly, offering coffee as though nothing unusual had happened between their families. After a few moments of uncomfortable conversation, Michael finally admitted why he had come. "Everyone keeps talking about the wedding," he said softly. "But something about all of this doesn't feel right. I don't know why, but I feel like there's something nobody understands." Olivia looked at him for a long moment before offering a gentle smile. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be chased," she answered. "Sometimes it simply waits until everyone is ready to see it." Michael left her home with more questions than answers, completely unaware that within a matter of days those questions would begin unraveling a carefully constructed illusion that had fooled almost everyone. The invitations had been mailed, the venue had been prepared, and the guests were eagerly anticipating a celebration of love. None of them realized they were actually on their way to witnessing one of the most astonishing revelations any family in that town had ever experienced. As the wedding day drew closer, excitement swept through the Brooks family with such intensity that almost no one stopped to question how quickly everything had unfolded. Margaret embraced every opportunity to remind friends that her son had finally found someone she believed truly matched his success. She toured the estate with decorators, discussed floral arrangements beneath towering oak trees, and proudly pointed toward the grand ballroom where the reception would take place. Every room seemed to reflect the life she had always imagined for Ethan. Guests would arrive through handcrafted iron gates, musicians would perform beneath crystal chandeliers, and photographers would capture every elegant detail from sunrise until the final dance. Margaret walked through those halls as though they already belonged to her family forever. She never once noticed the discreet brass plaque mounted inside the estate management office identifying the legal ownership trust. Even if she had, she likely would have assumed it represented another technical business arrangement handled by Ethan's accountants. Confidence has a remarkable way of convincing people they already know the answers before they have asked a single question. Olivia spent those same days in an entirely different world. Rather than attending planning meetings or responding to family gossip, she traveled to one of the children's education centers supported by her foundation several hours outside the city. Watching young students celebrate scholarships and reading programs brought her a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Parents thanked volunteers, teachers celebrated milestones, and children laughed without any awareness of the complicated legal and emotional storm unfolding elsewhere. Standing inside one brightly decorated classroom, Olivia found herself reflecting on something her father used to tell her whenever life became difficult. Character is measured by what you protect after someone has hurt you. At the time, she had interpreted those words as encouragement to guard her kindness. Now she understood they also meant protecting her integrity. She refused to allow betrayal to transform her into someone consumed by revenge. The legal documents waiting inside Richard Lawson's office represented enormous power, yet she hoped with every part of herself that circumstances would never require using them publicly. Late that afternoon, Richard called with news that immediately changed the direction of everything. One of the commercial banks financing Ethan's latest business expansion had contacted his office requesting clarification regarding collateral listed in a pending loan agreement. According to the documents submitted by Ethan's financial advisors, several high-value commercial properties in the family estate had been presented as assets supporting the company's financial position. Richard listened carefully before requesting copies of every document involved. Within an hour, the paperwork arrived, confirming exactly what he feared. None of those properties legally belonged to Ethan. Every deed remained under trusts controlled by Olivia. Richard immediately contacted Olivia and explained the seriousness of the situation. "This is no longer simply a family matter," he said calmly. Financial institutions are making decisions based on ownership claims that don't match the public records. We have to address this before those agreements move any further. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had spent months hoping the truth could remain quietly in the background. Now circumstances were making that impossible. The following morning, Olivia met Richard inside a conference room overlooking the downtown skyline. Spread across the polished oak table were property deeds, trust certificates, shareholder records, corporate filings, tax documents, and decades of carefully maintained legal history. Richard organized every file into chronological order before speaking. When your father created this structure, he wanted to prevent exactly this type of confusion. Ownership was intentionally separated from day-to-day management. Ethan managed several companies successfully, but management authority and ownership are two very different things. He handed Olivia another folder containing lease agreements connecting Ethan's corporate headquarters to one of her holding companies. She stared at the signatures for several moments. Everything had always been transparent within the legal records. Nothing had been hidden. The information simply went unnoticed because no one ever imagined the quiet woman standing beside Ethan could also be the owner standing behind nearly every major asset associated with his success. Richard leaned back thoughtfully before asking a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. If the wedding proceeds as planned, when do you want the truth to become known? Olivia looked toward the window where sunlight reflected across neighboring buildings. She had replayed that question countless times inside her own mind without ever reaching a satisfying answer. I don't want to interrupt their wedding, she finally whispered. No matter what has happened, I don't want innocent guests caught in something they never caused. Richard nodded respectfully. Then perhaps the truth doesn't have to arrive before the ceremony begins, he replied. But it cannot remain hidden much longer, especially if legal ownership continues being represented inaccurately. They spent the next several hours discussing every possible outcome. Each option carried emotional consequences, yet one reality remained unavoidable. Documents establishing ownership could not be ignored indefinitely simply because revealing them would embarrass people who had relied upon assumptions instead of facts. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed unusually relaxed. Friends commented that he appeared happier than they had seen him in years. Vanessa enthusiastically discussed honeymoon plans, future renovations to the estate, and charitable galas she hoped to host as Ethan's wife. She browsed furniture catalogs, selected artwork for rooms she believed would soon become hers, and spoke excitedly about redesigning the gardens surrounding the mansion. During one conversation with the estate's interior design consultant, she casually suggested replacing several pieces of antique furniture that had belonged to Olivia's family for generations. The consultant listened politely before explaining that no alterations could be approved without written authorization from the ownership office. Vanessa smiled confidently and assured him the paperwork would be easy to obtain after the wedding. The consultant simply thanked her and changed the subject. Years of working with wealthy families had taught him never to assume the person making requests was necessarily the person holding legal authority. Only days remained before the ceremony when Michael quietly arrived at Richard Lawson's office carrying a question that had been troubling him ever since his visit with Olivia. Richard welcomed him into the reception area, unaware of the reason for the unexpected meeting. After several moments of hesitation, Michael finally admitted that he feared something important was being hidden from the family. He wasn't searching for gossip or legal advice. He simply couldn't reconcile Olivia's remarkable calm with the public humiliation she had endured. Richard chose his words carefully. Professional ethics prevented him from discussing confidential matters, but he offered one observation that lingered in Michael's thoughts long after the meeting ended. Never mistake silence for weakness, Richard said quietly. Some people remain silent because they have nothing to say. Others remain silent because the truth doesn't require constant defending. Michael thanked him and walked outside more convinced than ever that the story everyone believed was incomplete. On the evening before the wedding, the estate glowed beneath thousands of carefully arranged lights as final preparations continued late into the night. Caterers organized elegant dining rooms, florists arranged towering displays of white roses, musicians rehearsed beneath the stars, and guests from across the country began arriving at nearby hotels. Margaret stood on the grand balcony overlooking the property, overwhelmed with pride as she admired what she believed represented the beginning of a perfect new chapter. Ethan wrapped his arm around Vanessa while photographers captured engagement portraits against the magnificent backdrop of the mansion. Laughter echoed across the gardens, champagne glasses clinked together in celebration, and every conversation centered on the happiness awaiting the bride and groom. Hidden inside Richard Lawson's leather briefcase, however, rested certified copies of every document capable of changing that celebration forever. By sunrise, those documents would accompany him to the estate. He wasn't attending as a guest. He wasn't arriving to offer congratulations. He was coming because the law had finally reached the point where silence was no longer an option. Within a few short hours, one carefully protected secret would step into the light, and an entire family would discover that everything they believed they owned had, from the very beginning, belonged to someone they had spent years underestimating. Morning arrived beneath clear blue skies, and the estate looked as though it had been lifted from the pages of an architectural magazine. Every pathway had been carefully swept, fountains sparkled beneath the rising sun, and rows of white roses framed the entrance where guests would soon begin arriving. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway as photographers moved from one location to another, capturing every carefully arranged detail before the ceremony began. Inside the mansion, laughter echoed through upstairs dressing rooms where bridesmaids admired Vanessa's gown while makeup artists and stylists hurried through their final preparations. Downstairs, servers polished crystal glasses beneath towering chandeliers, musicians rehearsed one final time inside the grand ballroom, and wedding planners checked schedules with remarkable precision. To everyone present, the day represented a joyful celebration of new beginnings. Nobody sensed that another story was unfolding quietly beyond the excitement, a story that would soon leave every conversation in complete silence. Margaret moved through the estate greeting arriving relatives with unmistakable pride. She embraced old friends, introduced business associates to distant family members, and repeatedly thanked everyone for joining them on what she described as the happiest day of Ethan's life. Every compliment she received strengthened her confidence that every difficult decision leading to this moment had been justified. When someone casually asked whether she had considered inviting Olivia as a gesture of courtesy, Margaret's smile faded for only a moment before she answered that the past belonged exactly where it should remain. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the response carried more satisfaction than compassion, but no one wished to create tension before the ceremony. They politely changed the subject and continued admiring the breathtaking estate, never imagining that the woman whose absence was barely acknowledged remained the legal owner of every magnificent structure surrounding them. Across town, Olivia stood quietly inside her father's old library, a room she visited whenever life demanded difficult decisions. Shelves filled with leather-bound books stretched from floor to ceiling, family photographs rested beside antique clocks that had measured the passing of generations, and sunlight filtered gently through tall windows overlooking carefully maintained gardens. Resting on the large mahogany desk before her lay the leather portfolio Richard had prepared. Inside were certified copies of trust agreements, corporate ownership records, property deeds, shareholder certificates, and legal opinions confirming every significant asset connected to Ethan's public success ultimately belonged to holdings under her authority. Olivia slowly closed the folder and placed both hands upon it. Her thoughts wandered back to the promise she had made her father years earlier. He had never asked her to protect wealth above people. He had asked her to protect truth above pride. The difference between those two responsibilities suddenly became painfully clear. Richard arrived shortly afterward, dressed formally for the occasion but carrying none of the excitement expected of a wedding guest. Instead, his calm expression reflected the seriousness of a man who understood that every document inside his briefcase possessed the power to alter several lives before the afternoon ended. As they prepared to leave, he looked toward Olivia with quiet concern. "You still have time to stay away," he said gently. "If you choose, I can handle everything without you being present." Olivia considered the offer before shaking her head. "No," she answered softly. "For years I allowed other people to tell my story because I believed silence would preserve peace. Today isn't about humiliating anyone. It's about allowing the truth to stand on its own." Richard nodded respectfully. During decades of legal practice, he had represented powerful executives, political leaders, and influential families, yet he could not remember many clients who had shown such restraint after enduring so much public humiliation. He silently hoped that restraint would continue serving Olivia well during the difficult hours ahead. Guests soon filled the outdoor ceremony space overlooking the estate's expansive gardens. Conversations drifted through the warm afternoon air as old friends reunited and relatives admired the extraordinary setting. Many praised Ethan's remarkable success, commenting on the beautiful mansion and impressive grounds they assumed reflected years of careful investment. Business associates congratulated him on building what appeared to be an extraordinary legacy at such a relatively young age. Ethan accepted every compliment graciously, never realizing that each one rested upon assumptions he himself had never bothered to verify. Vanessa stepped gracefully onto the aisle moments later, drawing smiles and admiration from everyone gathered beneath the floral archway. Margaret watched proudly from the front row, convinced every sacrifice she believed she had made for her son's happiness had finally been rewarded. Looking around at the magnificent estate, she quietly whispered to a close friend, "Everything you see here will belong to them now." Fate has a remarkable way of allowing confident declarations to exist only moments before exposing how completely they miss the truth. The ceremony began beautifully. The officiant welcomed family and friends before speaking about commitment, loyalty, trust, and the importance of building a future upon honesty. Those words lingered strangely in the air, unnoticed by most guests yet impossible to ignore for the small number of people who understood how complicated the circumstances truly were. As vows approached, movement near the entrance quietly drew the attention of several attendees seated toward the back. Richard Lawson had arrived carrying his familiar leather briefcase. Walking several steps behind him was Olivia, dressed with understated elegance, her expression composed, her posture calm, and her eyes fixed not upon Ethan or Vanessa but upon the path ahead. A gentle wave of whisper spread across the audience as guests recognized the woman many believed had disappeared quietly from Ethan's life weeks earlier. Margaret's smile faded almost instantly. She leaned toward one of the wedding coordinators and whispered something urgently before looking back toward the entrance with visible irritation. Ethan turned just long enough to notice Olivia taking a seat near the rear of the gathering. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly convinced himself she had come seeking closure rather than confrontation. The officiant resumed speaking, inviting everyone to focus upon the couple standing together beneath the archway. Yet attention had already begun shifting elsewhere. Richard remained standing near the side of the ceremony space, quietly checking the time before exchanging a brief glance with Olivia. Neither spoke a single word. They didn't need to. Weeks of preparation had led to this precise moment. Every legal requirement had been reviewed repeatedly. Every document had been certified, copied, and organized according to the order in which it might become necessary. Richard had hoped until the very last moment that circumstances would somehow make his involvement unnecessary. Unfortunately, another message had arrived less than an hour earlier from the bank financing Ethan's newest commercial project. Final approvals had been scheduled for that afternoon based upon ownership declarations that were legally inaccurate. Waiting any longer could expose innocent parties to significant financial consequences. The truth could no longer remain hidden simply because revealing it would be uncomfortable. Just as the officiant invited the couple to exchange rings, a quiet but unmistakable voice interrupted from the side of the ceremony. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption," Richard said respectfully, addressing both the officiant and the assembled guests. "I would not be standing here today unless there were legal matters requiring immediate attention before these proceedings continue." The music stopped almost immediately. Conversations disappeared. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the attorney as confusion spread across the audience. Margaret rose from her seat, her face reflecting equal parts disbelief and anger. "This is completely inappropriate," she declared firmly. Richard remained composed. "Mrs. Brooks," he answered politely, "I understand your concern. However, the matters I must address involve legal ownership of this estate, several corporate entities connected to Mr. Brooks, and financial representations currently affecting multiple institutions. Delaying this discussion could create consequences extending far beyond today's ceremony." Ethan's expression changed noticeably. For the first time that entire morning, genuine uncertainty replaced confidence. Vanessa tightened her grip on the bouquet she was holding as an uneasy silence settled over the gardens. Olivia remained seated exactly where she was, offering no expression of satisfaction, no hint of triumph, and no sign that she had orchestrated the moment for revenge. She simply watched quietly, knowing that after years of assumptions, the truth was finally about to introduce itself. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound drifting across the gardens came from the fountain near the entrance, where flowing water suddenly seemed louder than the voices of nearly 200 guests standing in complete silence. The officiant lowered the ceremony book in his hands and looked uncertainly toward Ethan, unsure whether to continue or step aside. Wedding planners exchanged anxious glances, photographers lowered their cameras, and musicians quietly set their instruments down, sensing that whatever was about to happen would become far more significant than the celebration they had been hired to capture. Ethan stared at Richard with growing confusion. He had worked with the attorney many times over the years and respected his professionalism. Richard was not a man who interrupted weddings without extraordinary reason. That realization alone caused a feeling of unease Ethan had not experienced in years. Margaret, however, remained convinced the interruption represented nothing more than a desperate attempt to embarrass her family. She stepped forward with visible frustration. "Whatever this is," she said sharply, "it can wait until after the ceremony." Richard answered with the same calm tone that had defined his career. Unfortunately, it cannot. Richard carefully opened the leather briefcase resting beside him and removed several neatly organized folders secured with official certification seals. Rather than raising his voice, he spoke with measured clarity so every guest could hear exactly why he had interrupted. This morning my office received confirmation that financial institutions are preparing to finalize transactions involving properties and business assets currently being represented as belonging to Mr. Ethan Brooks. Those representations are legally inaccurate. Because those transactions may proceed today, I am professionally and legally obligated to correct the public record before any additional agreements are executed. Confused murmurs swept through the audience. Ethan frowned, clearly believing some administrative mistake had occurred. There must be an error, he replied. My accountants handle those matters. Richard nodded respectfully. I believe that possibility should be examined first. It has been examined. There is no administrative error. He paused briefly before continuing. The issue is ownership. Vanessa slowly lowered her bouquet, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. She looked toward Ethan, expecting him to dismiss the misunderstanding immediately. Instead, he remained silent. Margaret folded her arms tightly across her chest and addressed Richard again. If this concerns paperwork, my son can sign whatever needs signing after the wedding. Richard looked directly at her. Mrs. Brooks, signatures cannot transfer ownership that does not legally exist. Those words settled over the gathering with astonishing weight. Several business associates seated near the front quietly exchanged puzzled looks. They had invested alongside Ethan for years, attended shareholder meetings, and negotiated commercial contracts believing he controlled substantial real estate holdings. None of them had ever requested detailed ownership records because Ethan's reputation appeared unquestionable. For the first time, many began wondering whether they had accepted assumptions instead of verifying facts. Richard removed the first certified document and held it where Ethan could clearly see the official seal. This is the recorded property deed for the estate where we are gathered today. He handed a copy to Ethan before placing identical certified copies into the hands of the officiant and one of the bank representatives who had quietly arrived moments earlier. Ethan scanned the first page confidently, expecting confirmation of what he had believed for years. Then his eyes stopped. He read the document again. His breathing became noticeably slower. He turned another page before returning to the first, searching for something he thought he must have overlooked. The legal owner listed on the deed was not Ethan Brooks. It never had been. The estate belonged to the Carter Family Preservation Trust, with Olivia Carter identified as the controlling beneficiary and sole decision-making authority. Ethan looked up slowly, unable to hide the confusion spreading across his face. This can't be right, he whispered. Richard answered quietly. It has been correct for more than 12 years. Before anyone could fully process that revelation, Richard placed a second folder on the table prepared for the wedding registry. This contains the ownership records for the corporate headquarters occupied by Brooks Strategic Holdings. Ethan reached for the documents with noticeably unsteady hands. Again, the results were identical. The land beneath the headquarters belonged to another holding company controlled through Olivia's trust. Long-term lease agreements clearly showed Ethan's business operating from property it did not own. Richard continued methodically, never raising his voice, never displaying satisfaction, simply presenting one certified record after another. Shopping centers, office buildings, distribution warehouses, investment partnerships, rental communities, luxury vacation properties. Each document revealed another asset the Brooks family had publicly claimed for years but legally did not possess. Every page pointed back to the same carefully structured network established decades earlier by Olivia's father. Every signature, every filing, every government record confirmed exactly the same reality. Olivia had never borrowed wealth from Ethan. Ethan had unknowingly built his public image upon foundations quietly provided by Olivia. A wave of disbelief swept through the audience. Some guests instinctively reached for the document copies being quietly distributed among key witnesses. Others simply stared toward Olivia, whose calm expression had not changed since arriving. She remained seated near the back of the gathering, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. There was no satisfaction in her eyes. If anything, there was sadness. She had never wanted the truth to emerge this way. She had hoped respect would survive without needing proof of ownership. Watching people suddenly reassess her value because of legal documents rather than character brought no joy. Richard understood exactly what she was feeling. Turning toward the guests, he spoke carefully. Mrs. Carter has never concealed these records. They have always existed within public filings, trust documentation, and property registries available through lawful channels. No fraud has occurred. No documents have been altered. The facts have remained unchanged for years. They were simply never examined because everyone believed assumptions were sufficient. Margaret's confidence finally collapsed beneath the weight of the evidence. She looked from one document to another before turning toward Ethan with growing panic. "Tell him he's wrong," she pleaded. "You bought this house. You built this company. You told me." Her voice trailed away before she could finish the sentence. Ethan opened his mouth but found no words. Memories flooded back with startling clarity. Every difficult season when unexpected financing had appeared just in time. Every commercial property purchased through advisors who assured him the legal structure had already been arranged. Every business opportunity made possible by investors introduced through Olivia's quiet connections. He had accepted every success without asking enough questions because each achievement reinforced the belief that he alone had created the life standing before him. For the first time, he realized how many people had quietly protected his confidence while never claiming recognition for themselves. Vanessa took a slow step backward. The elegant future she had imagined only moments earlier suddenly seemed uncertain. She hadn't fallen in love with Ethan because of money alone, but she couldn't deny that the image of extraordinary success had shaped many of her expectations. Looking around the estate, she no longer saw certainty. She saw unanswered questions. If the mansion wasn't his, if the companies weren't truly his, if even the wedding venue belonged to someone else, then how much of the life she believed she was entering had actually been built upon assumptions? The confidence she had carried throughout the engagement quietly disappeared. She glanced toward Olivia for the first time that afternoon, and instead of seeing a defeated former wife, she saw a woman who had endured months of humiliation without revealing the one truth capable of ending every argument in a single moment. Richard closed the final folder and looked toward Ethan with genuine compassion. "This was never about proving someone richer than someone else," he said quietly. "It is about correcting the legal record before decisions are made based upon information that is simply not true." He then turned respectfully toward Olivia. For several moments she remained seated, almost reluctant to stand. Finally, she rose slowly and walked toward the front of the ceremony. Every eye followed her. She stopped only a few feet from Ethan, not with anger, not with pride, but with unmistakable disappointment. After everything that had happened, there was only one question left to ask, and the answer would determine whether the story ended with justice, regret, forgiveness, or consequences far greater than anyone gathered beneath those wedding flowers had imagined. Olivia stood quietly before the guests, her eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time since the ceremony had been interrupted. The silence between them carried more weight than any speech ever could. Months earlier, she had imagined countless versions of this moment. In some, she defended herself with anger. In others, she exposed every secret the instant the divorce papers reached her hands. Yet standing there now, surrounded by stunned relatives and strangers who suddenly viewed her through an entirely different lens, she discovered that none of those imagined victories brought satisfaction. She saw a man she had once loved, a family she had once embraced as her own, and a celebration that had collapsed under the weight of assumptions. Taking a slow breath, she spoke softly enough that the audience instinctively leaned closer to hear every word. "I didn't come here to stop your wedding," she began. "If that had been my goal, I could have done it weeks ago. I came because the truth finally reached a point where remaining silent would have allowed innocent people to make decisions based on information that wasn't real. That's not justice. That's confusion. I never wanted anyone to experience that." Her calm voice echoed gently through the gardens. There was no accusation in her words, no bitterness directed toward Vanessa, and no attempt to embarrass Margaret before the assembled guests. "For years," Olivia continued, "I believed love didn't need to announce what it contributed. When Ethan's business struggled, I helped because I believed that was what partners did. When opportunities appeared at exactly the right moment, I never asked for recognition because I thought our success belonged to both of us. I never imagined that one day my silence would become the reason people believed I had contributed nothing." She paused briefly, allowing those words to settle. Several guests lowered their eyes, suddenly remembering conversations where they had praised Ethan's achievements while barely acknowledging the woman who had quietly stood beside him. Looking back, many realized Olivia had never once corrected those compliments. She had simply smiled, applauded, and allowed her husband to enjoy every moment of recognition. That realization made the afternoon's revelations even more painful. Ethan struggled to speak. His hands still held the property records Richard had placed before him, yet the documents no longer felt like legal paperwork. They felt like evidence of years he had misunderstood. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you ever tell me everything belonged to you? Olivia looked at him with unmistakable sadness. Because I wanted a husband who loved me before knowing what I owned, she answered. And after we married, I wanted to believe that no amount of money would ever become more important than the promises we made to each other. Tears formed in Ethan's eyes as memories rushed through his mind with painful clarity. He remembered the first office lease that had somehow been approved despite his weak financial position. He remembered investors appearing unexpectedly after meetings he believed had gone nowhere. He remembered difficult seasons when suppliers extended extraordinary patience and lenders approved financing that, in hindsight, should never have been possible. He had called those moments luck. Standing before Olivia now, he understood they had been quiet acts of faith from a woman who believed in him more than he had ever realized. Margaret, however, found the truth almost impossible to accept. If everything you're saying is true, she interrupted, her voice trembling, why did you let us believe otherwise? Olivia turned toward her gently. Mrs. Brooks, she replied, I never asked anyone to believe something that wasn't true. I never claimed Ethan owned these properties. I never introduced myself as someone without resources. People simply assumed, and because those assumptions benefited someone I loved, I never felt the need to correct them. Margaret searched desperately through years of conversations, trying to remember a single occasion when Olivia had actually lied about money. She couldn't. Every conclusion she had reached had come from observation, pride, and confidence rather than direct evidence. That realization struck harder than any public embarrassment ever could. She had spent years judging a woman she barely understood while never asking the most important questions. Vanessa slowly stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Olivia. Did you know about me? She asked quietly. Olivia nodded once. Long before anyone imagined I did. Vanessa lowered her head. Why didn't you confront me? The answer came without hesitation. Because my marriage was between Ethan and me. You didn't make promises to me. He did. Those words settled heavily over the gathering. Vanessa felt tears forming as she replayed every conversation she had shared with Margaret, every compliment she had accepted about replacing Olivia, and every assumption she had made about the life waiting for her after the wedding. She realized she had entered a story believing she understood its beginning, when in reality she had only arrived near the end. The confidence that had once surrounded her disappeared entirely, replaced by the painful awareness that she had built dreams upon a foundation she had never truly examined. Then Richard quietly cleared his throat, reminding everyone that legal matters still required attention. There is one final issue that must be addressed, he said. Because several financial representations involving these properties have already been submitted to lenders and commercial partners, corrective documentation will need to be executed immediately. He turned toward Ethan with genuine professionalism rather than criticism. Mr. Brooks, your company may continue operating exactly as before under existing lease agreements, provided all ownership records are accurately reflected going forward. Mrs. Carter has not requested eviction, liquidation, or immediate termination of any contracts. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. After everything that had happened, many expected Olivia to reclaim every property without hesitation. Instead, she had chosen stability over revenge. Richard continued, Mrs. Carter's only request has been that legal ownership be acknowledged truthfully and that no further financial decisions rely upon inaccurate assumptions. Several bankers exchanged relieved glances. The situation remained deeply embarrassing, but catastrophic financial collapse had been avoided because of Olivia's restraint. Ethan looked toward Olivia with tears now impossible to hide. After everything I've done, you're still protecting me? He asked. Olivia closed her eyes briefly before answering. I'm protecting innocent employees who depend on those companies to feed their families. I'm protecting tenants who live in those buildings. I'm protecting people who never chose to become part of our personal pain. She hesitated before adding the sentence that pierced every heart gathered there. Compassion isn't something you practice only when people deserve it. Otherwise, it isn't compassion at all. Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Even those who had judged Olivia harshly found themselves overwhelmed by the grace she continued extending to people who had shown her so little in return. The officiant quietly closed the ceremony book and looked toward Ethan and Vanessa. Neither moved. The wedding that had seemed so certain only minutes earlier now felt impossible to continue. Vanessa slowly removed the engagement ring from her finger and placed it gently into Ethan's hand. I can't marry someone who still has unfinished promises behind him, she said softly. This isn't the beginning I thought it was. Without another word, she turned and walked down the aisle alone, passing rows of silent guests who instinctively stepped aside to let her through. No one attempted to stop her. Margaret called after her once, but Vanessa never looked back. She understood that continuing the ceremony would not erase the truth revealed that afternoon. Some moments change lives so completely that pretending nothing happened becomes impossible. As the guests slowly began leaving the estate, conversations remained unusually quiet. There were no dramatic arguments, no shouting, and no celebrations of anyone's downfall. Instead, people carried away a lesson they would remember for years. Wealth had not revealed Olivia's value. It had only exposed how many people had failed to recognize it before discovering what she owned. Ethan remained standing beneath the wedding arch long after almost everyone had departed, holding the engagement ring in one hand and the certified property records in the other. For the first time in many years, success, reputation, and public admiration meant almost nothing to him. He finally understood that the greatest thing he had ever possessed had never been the businesses, the mansion, or the fortune surrounding him. It had been the trust of a woman who believed in him long before anyone else did. And by the time he recognized its worth, he feared he had already lost it forever. The estate that had echoed with celebration only hours earlier now stood in remarkable silence. Workers quietly removed floral arrangements, folded elegant white chairs, and packed away decorations that had never fulfilled their intended purpose. Musicians loaded their instruments into waiting vehicles without speaking much to one another, while caterers boxed untouched meals that had been prepared for a reception that would never take place. It was an unusual sight. Grand celebrations rarely ended this way. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle beyond the simple presentation of truth. Yet somehow the quiet aftermath felt even more powerful than anger would have been. As guests slowly drove away through the estate gates, many found themselves replaying Olivia's words instead of discussing the extraordinary fortune she possessed. The legal documents had captured everyone's attention, but her refusal to seek revenge had captured their respect. Long after the flowers faded and the decorations disappeared, that was the part of the day people would continue talking about. Ethan remained alone beneath the wedding arch until the last of the guests had gone. The expensive tuxedo he had worn with such confidence that morning now felt strangely meaningless. Richard approached him quietly, carrying the same leather briefcase that had changed the course of the afternoon. For several moments neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Did everyone know except me?" he asked without looking up. Richard answered honestly. "No. Very few people knew the complete structure of your late father-in-law's estate. Olivia honored his wish for privacy, and I honored my professional responsibility to protect confidential legal matters. The information was never hidden. It simply wasn't discussed because she believed it wasn't necessary." Ethan nodded slowly. Every answer seemed to uncover another painful realization. He had spent years believing silence meant emptiness when, in reality, it had often reflected loyalty. Olivia had protected his confidence, his reputation, and even his pride without ever asking for recognition. Looking back, he couldn't remember a single occasion when she had attempted to make him feel smaller because of what she owned. The opposite was true. She had quietly elevated him while allowing the world to believe every achievement belonged entirely to him. That evening, Ethan drove back to the house he had always called home. The long driveway seemed unfamiliar despite having traveled it thousands of times before. Every stone pathway, every carefully maintained garden, and every light illuminating the entrance now carried a different meaning. He walked slowly through the front doors, no longer seeing a symbol of his success but rather a reminder of Olivia's generosity. The photographs lining the hallway caught his attention one by one. There they were on their honeymoon, smiling beside a quiet mountain lake. Another showed them celebrating the opening of his first office. A third captured Olivia applauding from the audience while he accepted an award recognizing entrepreneurial excellence. Looking closely, Ethan noticed something he had somehow missed for years. In every photograph celebrating his achievements, Olivia stood slightly behind him, smiling with genuine pride while never attempting to stand at the center of attention. She had spent years making sure his light shined brightly enough that no one noticed she was quietly holding the lamp. Unable to sleep, Ethan wandered into the study where he had handed Olivia the divorce papers only weeks earlier. The room felt colder than he remembered. Sitting behind the desk, he opened drawer after drawer until he found an old leather journal Olivia had given him during the early years of their marriage. Inside its pages she had written a short note on the first anniversary of his company. "I have never doubted what you're capable of becoming. No matter how successful you become, I hope you always remember that the strongest foundations are built where no one else can see them." Ethan read the sentence repeatedly until tears blurred the ink before his eyes. At the time, he had interpreted those words as encouragement. Now they felt almost like a warning he had completely misunderstood. He had spent years strengthening the visible parts of his life while quietly neglecting the unseen foundation supporting everything else. Success had expanded his business, but pride had slowly narrowed his perspective until he no longer recognized the person who had believed in him from the very beginning. Across the city, Olivia returned to her father's library once again. For the first time in months, the weight she carried felt slightly lighter, though not because she had exposed the truth. She felt lighter because she no longer needed to carry it alone. Sitting beside the fireplace, she reflected on everything that had happened. She took no satisfaction in the wedding's collapse. She genuinely wished circumstances had unfolded differently. If Ethan had chosen honesty months earlier, if Margaret had valued character above appearances, if assumptions had been replaced with simple conversations, none of the heartbreak would have been necessary. Richard quietly joined her later that evening after ensuring every legal matter had been properly documented. He placed a single envelope on the table beside her. "What's this?" Olivia asked. Richard smiled gently. "Letters from your father. He instructed me years ago to give them to you only if there ever came a day when you questioned whether protecting your integrity had been worth the cost." Olivia looked at the envelope with surprise. She had never known those letters existed. With careful hands, she unfolded the first letter. Her father's familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to her eyes. "My dear Olivia," it began, "if you are reading this, life has probably asked more of your heart than I ever hoped it would. There may come a time when people mistake your kindness for weakness, your patience for surrender, and your silence for a lack of value. If that day arrives, remember something I learned far too late. The people who only recognize your worth after discovering your wealth were never measuring your true worth to begin with. Forgive whenever you can, but never confuse forgiveness with surrendering your dignity. Protect your peace with the same determination you once used to protect those you loved." Olivia paused several times while reading, wiping away tears that quietly rolled down her face. The words felt as though her father had somehow witnessed everything that would eventually happen years before it unfolded. Several days passed before Ethan found the courage to request one final meeting with Olivia. He didn't ask through family members or mutual friends. Instead, he wrote a handwritten letter and delivered it personally to Richard's office, asking only that Olivia read it if she felt comfortable doing so. The letter contained no excuses, no attempts to blame others, and no promises designed to erase the past. It simply acknowledged the painful truth. Ethan admitted that somewhere along the path toward success he had begun measuring people by admiration instead of loyalty. He confessed that he had mistaken quiet strength for ordinary simplicity and allowed the opinions of others to become louder than the voice of the woman who had stood beside him from the beginning. The final paragraph contained only one request. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve another chance. But if you would allow me one conversation, not to repair what I've broken but to properly thank the person who built a future I was foolish enough to believe I had created alone, I would spend the rest of my life grateful for that opportunity." Olivia read the letter several times before folding it carefully and placing it inside her father's journal. She didn't answer immediately. Some decisions deserve time because rushed emotions often produce lasting regrets. She walked through the gardens surrounding her home as evening settled across the landscape, reflecting on everything that had changed. Forgiveness had never frightened her. Trust was different. Trust required more than remorse. It required transformation visible not in words but in consistent actions over time. She understood that distinction better than ever before. Looking toward the horizon as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Olivia quietly whispered a sentence her father often repeated during difficult seasons. "The future should never be held hostage by the past, but neither should the past be forgotten when building the future." Whether Ethan would ever receive the opportunity to prove he had truly changed remained uncertain. What was certain was that Olivia no longer measured her life by whether someone else recognized her worth. She had finally rediscovered something far more valuable than the fortune she legally owned. She had rediscovered the peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the world spends years seeing only what it expects to see. For nearly 3 weeks, Olivia didn't respond to Ethan's letter. It wasn't because she wanted him to suffer in uncertainty. She simply understood that some decisions should never be made while emotions are still settling. Every morning she continued her routine as though life itself were gently encouraging her to move forward. She attended meetings for the foundation, visited community projects her father had started years before, and spent quiet evenings reading through family journals that had remained untouched since his passing. Those journals revealed stories she had never heard before. They described business failures her father had overcome, friendships he had lost because of money, and moments when he questioned whether success had cost him too much. One passage remained in her thoughts more than any other. The greatest wealth you will ever possess, he had written, is the ability to leave a room with your character intact, even when others leave believing they have defeated you. Olivia realized that without intending to, she had lived those words throughout the most difficult chapter of her life. She had walked away from humiliation without surrendering her dignity, and that victory could never be measured by property deeds or bank accounts. Across town, Ethan's life had become almost unrecognizable. News of the interrupted wedding spread rapidly throughout business circles, although the facts often became distorted as they passed from one conversation to another. Some people claimed Ethan had hidden assets, others insisted Olivia had secretly planned the public revelation for years. A few even suggested elaborate conspiracies involving inheritance disputes that never actually existed. Ethan could have corrected many of those rumors, but for the first time in years he chose complete honesty instead of protecting his reputation. During meetings with investors, lenders, and business partners, he openly acknowledged that several assumptions regarding ownership had been incorrect and accepted full responsibility for not verifying matters he should have understood long ago. Surprisingly, that honesty earned him more respect than denial ever could have. Many colleagues remained disappointed by his personal decisions, but they recognized the courage required to admit painful mistakes without shifting blame onto others. It was the first meaningful change in Ethan's character that anyone had witnessed since the collapse of his marriage. Margaret struggled far more than her son. For years she had measured success by appearances, believing admiration from others confirmed a life well lived. Overnight, that image disappeared. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. Conversations that once revolved around admiration now carried quiet sympathy. Friends who had enthusiastically celebrated Ethan and Vanessa's engagement suddenly avoided discussing the wedding altogether. Margaret initially blamed everyone except herself. She blamed Richard for presenting legal documents publicly. She blamed Olivia for attending the ceremony. She blamed Vanessa for walking away. She even blamed reporters for repeating details that had already become public record. Yet living alone inside the enormous guest house she now occupied gave her something she had spent years avoiding: uninterrupted time to think. Without constant social events and family celebrations filling every hour, memories began returning one after another. She remembered Olivia bringing homemade meals during illnesses, organizing birthdays that Margaret herself had forgotten, accompanying her to medical appointments without complaint, and quietly sitting beside her after the loss of old friends. Those memories carried no mention of money. They reflected kindness freely given without expectation of gratitude. For the first time, Margaret wondered whether she had spent years searching for qualities in people that mattered far less than the ones she had overlooked. Vanessa, meanwhile, quietly returned to the life she had known before meeting Ethan. She declined interviews, ignored gossip circulating online, and refused invitations to discuss the failed wedding publicly. Several magazines offered generous payments for exclusive interviews, promising she could tell her side of the story. She rejected every proposal. Friends questioned her decision, reminding her that public curiosity would eventually fade. Vanessa answered with remarkable honesty. Some stories don't belong in magazines. They belong inside the people who live them. She accepted responsibility for allowing herself to become involved in a relationship that should never have progressed while another marriage remained unresolved. Although she hadn't created every problem surrounding Ethan and Olivia, she recognized that her choices had contributed to pain she could no longer ignore. Quietly, without announcing it publicly, Vanessa began volunteering at a counseling center supporting families rebuilding after divorce. She never introduced herself by explaining who she had once been. She simply showed up each week determined to help people avoid repeating mistakes she wished she could erase from her own past. One crisp autumn afternoon, Olivia finally agreed to meet Ethan. She chose neither the family estate nor an expensive restaurant. Instead, she suggested a small botanical garden where they had shared one of their earliest dates years before either of them imagined wealth or business success would become part of their story. Ethan arrived early, carrying nothing except the leather journal Olivia had once given him. When she appeared, neither rushed toward the other. Time had changed them both. They walked slowly through quiet pathways lined with colorful autumn leaves before eventually sitting beneath the same old oak tree where they had once spoken excitedly about building a future together. For several minutes neither said anything. Words seemed almost inadequate after everything that had happened. Finally, Ethan looked toward her and spoke with a sincerity she hadn't heard in years. I spent months trying to understand where I lost you, he said quietly. Then I realized something much harder to accept. I didn't lose you in a single moment. I lost myself first. Olivia remained silent, allowing him to continue. I kept asking why you never told me about the fortune, Ethan said. Now I understand that wasn't the real question. The real question is why I stopped seeing the woman standing beside me long before I ever knew what she owned. He handed her the journal. Inside, tucked carefully between its pages, rested every award he had ever received throughout his business career. These don't mean what they used to, he admitted. Because every time I look at them, I remember that the person who celebrated them most sincerely was the person I appreciated the least. Olivia gently closed the journal before answering. Success didn't change you overnight, Ethan. It happened one decision at a time. Every moment you chose admiration over gratitude, appearance over character, and pride over humility moved you further away from the man I married. Her words carried no anger. They reflected painful truth spoken with remarkable compassion. Ethan lowered his eyes. Is there any path back? He asked quietly. Olivia looked toward the trees where autumn leaves drifted gently onto the walking paths. She considered the question carefully because false hope would have been easier than honesty. There may be a path forward for both of us, she replied. But it doesn't necessarily lead back to where we started. Some things, once broken, don't return to what they were before. Sometimes they become something entirely different. Sometimes they remain memories that teach us how to live better with someone else. Sometimes they become friendships built from lessons instead of promises. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she meant. She wasn't rejecting forgiveness. She was acknowledging reality. Love could survive many hardships, but trust rebuilt itself slowly, one consistent action at a time, and there were no guarantees that every bridge could be reconstructed simply because one person finally recognized its value after watching it collapse. As they prepared to leave the garden, Olivia stopped for a moment beside a small stone bench engraved with a simple inscription donated by an anonymous family years earlier. It read, "Character is revealed long before circumstances uncover it." She smiled softly after reading the words aloud. Ethan stood quietly beside her, reflecting on how perfectly that sentence described everything they had endured. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold. Perhaps they would eventually find peace as friends. Perhaps time would create possibilities neither could yet imagine. Or perhaps this meeting would become their final chapter together. Whatever happened next, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The interrupted wedding had never truly been the story's greatest turning point. The real turning point occurred the moment every person involved finally understood that wealth had never been the lesson. Character had been the lesson all along. And once that truth settled into every heart it touched, each of them faced the same question that now remains for all of us. If someone's title disappeared tomorrow, if their fortune vanished overnight, if every symbol of success were suddenly taken away, would we still recognize the value of the person standing before us, or would we only discover their worth after it was far too late? The months that followed became a season of quiet transformation for everyone whose lives had been touched by that unforgettable afternoon. News of the interrupted wedding slowly disappeared from newspaper headlines and television discussions, replaced by newer stories competing for public attention. Yet for those who had stood beneath the white floral arch that day, the memory refused to fade. They carried it into boardrooms, family dinners, church gatherings, neighborhood conversations, and private moments of reflection. What began as a shocking revelation about hidden ownership gradually became something much deeper. People no longer spoke only about the fortune Olivia possessed. They spoke about the remarkable restraint she displayed when she had every legal right to destroy the people who had hurt her. In a society where revenge often receives louder applause than forgiveness, her decision puzzled many observers. Some believed she had been too compassionate. Others insisted they would have acted very differently under the same circumstances. Yet almost everyone agreed on one point. They had never witnessed someone hold so much power while choosing to exercise so little of it against those who had caused such profound pain. Olivia quietly resumed responsibilities she had neglected while her marriage slowly unraveled. The charitable foundation expanded its scholarship program into neighboring states, opening educational opportunities for hundreds of students whose families had never imagined college would become possible. New community health initiatives reached rural towns lacking adequate medical resources, while affordable housing projects began restoring neighborhoods that had struggled for decades. Reporters occasionally requested interviews with Olivia, hoping she would finally discuss the extraordinary events surrounding the wedding. Every request received the same respectful response. She preferred allowing the foundation's work to remain the focus rather than revisiting personal heartbreak. Journalists found that answer almost impossible to understand. Public curiosity surrounding her story remained enormous, yet she consistently declined opportunities to defend herself or criticize anyone involved. One editor later remarked that Olivia had become famous for refusing to become famous. In an age where many people competed for attention, her quiet refusal only increased public admiration. Ethan dedicated himself to rebuilding his company with a completely different perspective than the one that had guided him before. During executive meetings, he began acknowledging employees whose contributions had previously gone unnoticed. Instead of accepting every compliment personally, he made a habit of recognizing the teams responsible for each achievement. He introduced financial transparency policies ensuring investors clearly understood ownership structures, partnerships, and long-term obligations before major decisions were finalized. Those changes required humility because they forced him to admit that previous assumptions had not always been carefully examined. Surprisingly, the company became stronger rather than weaker. Employees noticed the difference almost immediately. The ambitious executive who once seemed determined to receive every ounce of credit gradually became a leader more interested in sharing responsibility than collecting applause. Several longtime colleagues privately admitted they preferred working with this version of Ethan. Painful experiences had accomplished what years of professional success never could. They had taught him the difference between authority and leadership. Margaret's journey proved far more complicated. Pride rarely disappears overnight, especially after shaping someone's identity for decades. She initially struggled with loneliness more than guilt. The social circle she had carefully cultivated no longer revolved around elegant parties or conversations celebrating her family's accomplishments. For the first time in many years, she found herself spending quiet evenings alone with memories she could no longer avoid. One rainy afternoon she discovered an old photo album tucked inside a hallway cabinet while searching for holiday decorations. Page after page revealed moments she had almost forgotten. Olivia decorating birthday cakes for family celebrations. Olivia sitting beside her hospital bed after surgery. Olivia patiently helping younger cousins prepare for school performances. Olivia laughing with relatives during holidays when life seemed wonderfully uncomplicated. Margaret realized something that left her sitting motionless for nearly an hour. Almost every treasured family memory from the past decade included Olivia somewhere in the background, usually caring for someone else while asking for nothing in return. Margaret had spent years focusing on what she believed Olivia lacked while remaining almost completely blind to everything she consistently gave. Several weeks later, Margaret did something no one expected. Without informing Ethan beforehand, she drove alone to the foundation headquarters where Olivia worked. She wasn't carrying legal papers, financial proposals, or carefully prepared explanations. Instead, she held only a small cardboard box containing family photographs and handwritten recipes Olivia had once prepared during holiday gatherings. The receptionist politely informed Olivia that someone wished to see her. When Olivia entered the meeting room and saw Margaret waiting quietly by the window, surprise briefly crossed her face before giving way to gentle composure. Neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Margaret placed the box upon the table and quietly said, "I spent years believing I understood what made someone valuable. I was wrong." Her voice trembled noticeably as she continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me today. I don't know if I'll ever deserve that. I only know that I judged your worth by everything except the things that mattered most." Tears filled her eyes as she looked around the room. "The greatest mistake of my life wasn't encouraging my son to leave you. It was failing to recognize the daughter I already had." Olivia remained silent for several moments, allowing Margaret's words to settle. Forgiveness had always come naturally to her, but trust required something much more deliberate. Walking slowly toward the older woman, she placed one hand gently over Margaret's. "Carrying regret forever won't heal either of us," she said softly. "But healing doesn't happen because we wish for it. It happens because we choose differently every day that follows." Margaret nodded through quiet tears. They embraced briefly, not because every wound had suddenly disappeared, but because both women understood something important. Reconciliation is rarely a single dramatic moment. More often, it begins with one honest conversation followed by countless small decisions to live differently than before. As Margaret prepared to leave, Olivia handed her one of the foundation's volunteer brochures. "We're opening a new family support center next month," she said with a gentle smile. "If you'd ever like to help, there will always be room." Margaret accepted the brochure with trembling hands. For the first time in many years, she felt hope quietly replacing the pride that had cost her so much. Nearly a year after the interrupted wedding, the estate once again welcomed guests beneath its towering oak trees. This gathering, however, looked very different from the lavish celebration that had collapsed months earlier. There were no extravagant decorations, no expensive entertainment, and no elaborate displays of wealth. Instead, hundreds of scholarship recipients, volunteers, teachers, nurses, and community leaders gathered to celebrate the opening of a new educational and family resource center funded through Olivia's foundation. Children ran across the same gardens where silence had once settled over stunned wedding guests. Families laughed together beneath the same trees that had witnessed heartbreak. Richard Lawson watched quietly from the back of the audience, smiling as he realized the estate had finally become exactly what Olivia's father had always intended, a place where opportunities were created rather than appearances displayed. Ethan attended as an invited guest, sitting quietly among the volunteers without requesting special recognition. Margaret worked beside dozens of other volunteers serving meals to families, never mentioning who she was unless someone specifically asked. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled every moment of the present. As the afternoon drew to a close, Olivia stepped onto a small wooden platform overlooking the crowd. She thanked every volunteer, every donor, every teacher, and every family whose resilience inspired the foundation's work. Before leaving the stage, she shared one final thought that brought complete silence across the gathering. "Many people believe wealth changes lives," she said calmly. "Sometimes it does. But character changes generations. Buildings eventually grow old, businesses change ownership. Fortunes rise and fall. The way we treat one another when no reward is waiting, that is the legacy people remember long after everything else has faded." Those words lingered long after the applause ended. And perhaps that is the true ending of this story. Not the interrupted wedding. Not the hidden fortune. Not even the legal documents that changed everything in a single afternoon. The real ending is the quiet reminder that the greatest things we own can never be listed on a balance sheet. Respect. Integrity. Humility. Loyalty. Compassion. Those are the treasures no one can inherit, purchase, or steal. They must be chosen every single day. So before you leave today, take a moment to ask yourself one simple question. If someone walked into your life with nothing but kindness to offer, would you recognize their value before discovering everything else they possessed? Your answer may reveal far more about your own character than theirs. Please subscribe for more interesting stories.